Now Africans want reparations for Black Americans. What in the Nigerian scam artist is going on? While in discussion with world leaders, I guess Africa started to do the numbers on what Black Americans generate, which is a spending power around $4 trillion, and felt as if they had the audacity to really say that they should get reparations for how much we generate. My Lord. I was flabbergasted. The same Africans who sold their own people into slavery. The same Africans who come to the United States and say that they are better than Black Americans. That we are not the same. Well, we're not the same. You're not getting a dime. If anything, we should be at that table. Black Americans had nothing and created an entire culture that influenced the entire world. You can't take that from us.
We want tangibles as foundational Black Americans. And we're not going to let them redefine what reparations mean, right? Is reparations student loan debt? No. Is reparations HBCU funding? No. Is reparations minority business loans? No. Is reparations catfish nuggets? No. What's reparations? Money! What's reparations? Money! What's reparations? Money! Give yourselves a round of applause.
Grand rising kings and queens from Africa and across the ocean. I want to begin by saying that I see you, I hear you, and I thank you so much for tuning in. You are the heartbeat of this channel. Now, today we must have an honest conversation. We must have an honest conversation, one of the many conversations that people are afraid to start because something serious is happening. And I have been on social media these few days. I wasn't sure if I'm going to talk about it. And this is about the reparations talks or the reparations conversation between African Union and European Union. And it took time for me to say, let me discuss, because what is happening is African Union is talking about reparation with the European Union. And many of Black Americans community, Caribbean community, and African diaspora leaders, they are being left out of the process. And I want to say this with a lot of love, but with fire in my chest. You cannot talk about reparations for African people and ignore the diaspora. That's what I'm gonna say. You can't do that. You cannot. And that is what I was afraid to say, because I didn't know if it is really happening like that, because that's a joke, a very big joke, to talk about reparation without including the diaspora family. You cannot discuss justice while silencing the very people who carried the fight through slavery, segregation, colonialism, Jim Crow law, mass incarceration, and the modern prison industrial complex. You can't do that. And what is happening right now, if we don't address it, could lead to tearing apart of Black people. But if we speak right now and we stand firm, it could also be the moment to bring us together as Black people like never before. So that's what I'm gonna break down. But before I do that, I want to play you reaction of Black Americans, reactions of Africans in diaspora, talking about what is happening right now. But I have my whole conversation right here before you today. I'm gonna talk about that. Let's watch this.
So all this reparations talk with this African Union, I've gotten your comments and questions, and I don't know everything about it, but I can tell you this, is that the European Union is not going to ever want to include the diaspora, meaning that it's never going to want to include African Americans, the Caribbean, Afro, South America. It's not going to want to include all those that happened with the transatlantic slave trade. It's going to want to focus it all on Africa and African nations. Why? Because governments often prefer bilateral state-to-state deals, which are easier to manage and less controversial than payments to individuals in other countries. Reparations to the African Union or specific African nations may be framed as developmental aid, debt cancellation, museum returns, and symbolic gestures. These can be tightly controlled and often exclude diaspora descendants, such as Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Americans, Afro-Brazilians. See? The reason why the European Union would want to do this is to avoid a precedent. If the diaspora receives direct payments, the descendants of the enslaved receives direct payments, it could pressure the EU states to pay descendants within their own borders. Y'all see that? It could pressure the European Union states to pay descendants within their own borders. So they don't want to have it outside of Africa. Okay. Limit financial exposure. Reparations to Africa can be capped, politically framed as aid, and kept away from broader legal implications. If reparations are channeled only through the African Union with no diaspora voice or enforcement mechanisms, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Brazilians, and others may receive no material benefit. The historical role of slavery in the Americas, all of it, may be downplayed or excluded. Reparations become more about the development for African states, not justice for enslaved peoples and their descendants. Now, this is what should happen. It should include the diaspora communities as primary stakeholders, not afterthoughts. Primary stakeholders, not afterthoughts. Primary. Ensure any global reparations fund supports direct payments or programs for diaspora descendants, cultural, educational, and economic redress. Joint oversight bodies with diaspora representation. Use a Pan-African approach that doesn't pit Africa against the diaspora. And right now, everything is pitting Africa against the diaspora. I don't care how you look at it. It's going to pit Africa against the diaspora if they don't do it right. So civil pushback is growing from groups like CARICOM, the Caribbean Reparations Commission, National African American Reparations Commission, the NAARC, the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent are all pushing back against frameworks that exclude or minimize diaspora inclusion. Now I'm going to answer another question. Does the AU seek reparations from the United States? No, they're not seeking it from the United States. They're only seeking it from the EU. The African Union is only seeking it from the EU, not the United States. So where does that leave Black Americans? Exactly where we were. Exactly. It doesn't change anything for Black Americans. In the U.S., the primary movement for reparations is domestic, focused on direct compensation to Black Americans. H.R. 40 legislation to establish a federal commission to study reparations proposals reintroduced by Ayanna Pressley in 2025. Yeah. Local and state initiatives in cities like those in the Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity Coalition. Is the U.S. planning to send reparations to Africa instead of African Americans? No evidence exists that the U.S. government is considering redirecting reparations funds intended for African Americans toward African nations. The African Union's reparations agenda stands independently, is not tied to the U.S. policy discussions or planning. U.S. reparation efforts remain jurisdictionally focused on descendants of slavery within the U.S., not as a mechanism to benefit African states. There is no credible mechanism or suggestion that reparations from the U.S. will bypass Black Americans and instead go to Africa. That said, global discourse on reparations could influence the moral and political climate in which U.S. legislation is debated, but not on terms that exclude African Americans from receiving reparatory justice. Now, there are some questions about can all of the descendants and the Americans come together and sue Africa for their participation in the slave trade? This is a question, and I'm answering it. Not trying to offend anybody, but I'm answering the question, okay? It says legally it's extremely unlikely, but morally and politically it's a debated issue. Africa's role in the slave trade. Some African kingdoms and elites, the Dahomey, Ashanti, Oyo, Congo, actively participated in the slave trade, capturing and selling rival tribes and prisoners of war to European slavers. This participation has been acknowledged by some African leaders like Ghana's Jerry Rawlings and Benin's president, I don't know how to pronounce his name, who apologized in the early 2000s. However, these roles were not often as equal partners, but as intermediaries under massive European pressure, manipulation, and economic coercion. Also, coupled with the fact that African nations were also colonized and exploited, and thus are seen in international law as victims and not perpetrators of systemic justice, meaning that if they were not seen as international as victims under international law, it may be different, but they're seen as victims as well. Therefore, there is no international legal framework that allows descendants of victims to sue nations or institutions for their ancestors' role in slavery. African countries involved in the slave trade were not modern nation states. Okay, I repeat, they were not modern nation states. So no continuity of legal responsibility is recognized. Remember when the transatlantic slave trade happened, there were no modern nation states. Okay, that's why to say where a Black American the ancestors were from, or where someone in the Caribbean was from, or where someone in an Afro-Brazilian was from, is our forefathers were not from a modern nation state. They were from the land, Africa. They weren't from modern nation states. So, yeah, and we've already discussed this many times on this platform. The modern day countries that all the descendants of the enslaved across the Americas are from are the countries that they are in. Like Black American, the United States of America, Jamaicans, Jamaica, Afro-Brazilians, Brazil. Those are their nations. They are not immigrants. We are not immigrants. It also says suing modern African governments for pre-colonial actions would face insurmountable legal barriers. So is there a moral or political claim? While not legally viable, a moral or political claim could be made. If the African Union is demanding accountability from Europe, it should also acknowledge and take responsibility for the African participation. Reparations discourse should be honest and inclusive about all actors involved. Diaspora communities could call for acknowledgement, apologies, or joint reconciliation initiatives from African nations. Also, one thing that will go against it is focusing on African complicity could derail and dilute global calls for reparations from those who profited the most, the European empires and the United States. What's more likely than lawsuits? Reconciliation processes between African nations and diaspora communities, joint commemorative efforts, memorials, and Pan-African cooperation on education, healing, and cultural reconnection. African nations investing part or any reparations funds into diaspora outreach as a gesture of solidarity and shared history. So let's say the EU paid African nations. It is at that point that the African Union could say, we want to repair the damage. So they could say, we would invest in diaspora outreach as a gesture of solidarity and shared history. Will that happen? I don't know. I doubt it, but I'm just saying I doubt it. But I don't know. I'm just saying I doubt it. But as far as the Caribbean, which is mainly, okay, so if the African, I'm gonna go over here to this little point though. For the African Union and what their request for reparations from the European Union, right? If they just give it to African nations, the Caribbean is out. The Caribbean is out. And that's why the Caribbean has CARICOM, to try and push back against Europeans just giving it to the African nations. Okay? That's just it. And it's gonna pit the Caribbean. This whole thing right here now, you gotta watch this now. Now pay attention, because this is what people call white supremacy, quote unquote, okay? So pay attention. if the Europeans wanted to do that, and if Africa was okay with that, right? Because they've worked together before, right? We all know this. They could easily just take it to the African nations and pit the Caribbean against Africans, because Caribbean people would be pissed, and the African nation would have a choice. Either you're gonna give it to the Caribbean descendants, to the Brazilian descendants, to Black Americans, but in this case, I'm just talking about Caribbeans, or we gonna keep it. So whatever happens with the EU and the African nations is really going to end up being a monster chop if the African nations, the EU, the AU doesn't do right by the descendants of the enslaved. It's gonna be bad. Yeah, it'll be bad. But as far as the United States is concerned, if you're Black American, yeah, the United States of us. And they're already working on that. It's going to be a battle, but, we up for the challenge. Ain't never been nothing.
Peace, family. Listen, this channel is not for the advertisement of the African Union's initiative. It's not. These messages I'm getting about the African Union, I don't want them. Because my people are not really understanding how we became the sixth region of some organization that never even included us in a conversation. And if America ever was to send the African Union some money, I doubt a Black American in America would ever receive any of it. There's so much corruption on the African continent. That's why schools have holes in the ground for toilets and no sinks. That's why the average family is hustling for their day-to-day meal. And everybody's stuck in survival mode. You see what I'm saying? If Africa's own people are suffering like that, why would they send you some money in America where they feel like you're privileged? Why would they? You Black Americans that want to run over to Africa, I think you better consider some things. I'm not saying don't visit. You should visit so you can see and feel and know for yourself. You should visit. But you should be very careful about moving there. And I mean any part. If you are able to find a location that has a community that's going to support you and help you and give you guidance and be there when the shit hits the fan, because it will, I promise you. You see, it's a different kind of life over there. If you're walking down the street and somebody snatches the phone out of your hand, there's no cops coming to help you. There's no 911. If a man jumps out of a tree with a knife and threatens you to take your money, there's nobody you can call for help. The Pan-African movement is not on the ground and personally assisting you. You're on your own. You better know what to do about that man and his knife. You understand? If you move into a community and the locals don't like you and they start leaving dead chickens out your door and digging up the ground and burying juju in your yard, who's going to help you? Who? And where I was located, there's some Black Americans that never made it back to America. They had mysterious deaths. No investigation, no autopsy. Because those services aren't readily available either. It's not a normal of the process of a death. You die, they see you're dead, they bury you. If a crime is committed, no one may ever know why they found you in a ditch. And people are stuck in survival mode. No one might even care. Are you really prepared to live in an environment like that? But yeah, my channel's not advertisement for the AU. I don't want to hear about the AU. I'm not interested at all.
Welcome back. You have heard the reaction of Black Americans, and this is to tell you that Black Americans, they have fire on their chest because of this. And I cannot imagine African Union talking about or discussing about reparation with the European Union. People are saying Africans are colonizing the European Union through their name. Now, we have to understand the bigger picture here. The struggle for reparation isn't new. The struggle for reparation, it is not a hashtag. It is not a trend. It is not just about writing checks. Reparation is about repair. Reparation is about repair. And they are about restoration, recognition, and reconciliation. Reparation on the bigger picture is about healing generational wounds, healing generational trauma that was never treated, only buried. Now, let's understand the scale of what is happening or what happened to black people, and that's why they call for reparation. Now, colonialism is one of the things where European powers divided and conquered Africa, stole resources, and enslaved minds through cultural erasure, and that happened mostly in African community and in African countries. When I talk about colonization, where they colonized mind or enslaved the mind of the people, is where we talk about black people or Africans started doing things from the West, that they left their culture, they left their religion and followed the white man's culture. Number two, it's about slavery, where millions of Africans' bodies were stolen from Africa, were chained, were brutalized, and worked to death in the America. Another thing is segregation. When you talk about segregation and apartheid, we are talking about the system created to make black people second class citizens, and this was done in their own land. Someone comes here and makes me a second class on my own house. Another thing is modern exploitation, where black labor culture and brilliance are still extracted without justice. Now, I think we were in a class a little bit, but through all this, the diaspora never stopped fighting. From Malcolm X to Marcus Garvey, from Queen Mother Moore to Angela Davis, from Bob Marley the musician to John Henrik Clark, the diaspora never stopped fighting. Diaspora raised the call for reparation when no one else will do that. Now, the African Union and the European Union have finally come together in 2025 to hold transitional justice talks, and they are focusing on reparation. On paper, that sounds like progress. Yeah, on paper, it sounds like progress. We are talking about reparation. They are discussing funding models. They are discussing acknowledging colonial crimes. They are discussing building frameworks to restore justice. But let me talk about the hard question. Where is the diaspora here in this discussion? Where are the Black American leaders? Where are the Caribbean reparation commissions? Caribbeans have been fighting even recently. Caribbeans were protesting. They want reparation. When the Queen was visiting Jamaica, they were protesting. Where are the voices of those who still live with the psychological scars of slavery? And the answer is not at the table. They are not included at the table. Or if they are present, they are just observers. They are not decision makers. And that is not unity. That's what I condemn. That is not unity. That is erasure. That's erasure. When African governments were under pressure, when leaders were silenced, when the continent was caught in debt and dependency, it was Black Americans and Afro-Caribbeans who demanded reparation from colonial powers. Why are we forgetting that? The CARICOM reparation community has been one of the most active in the world. In the US, reparation bills have been debated in Congress for decades, and it was led by the descendants of enslaved Africans. Pan-African thinkers built the intellectual foundation of the modern reparation movement. The AU only began seriously using the word reparation in high-level policy talks in the last few years. So now, when the table are set for dialogue with Europe, how can you ignore the very people who dragged those tables into the room? How can you ignore that? There is already tension between some Black Americans and Africa. There's already tension between continental Africans and Black Americans. And we are seeing that if you think that it's a lie. You have seen the reaction. People are talking about this and they are not happy with it. And from these reactions, from these talks, you can tell there is a tension because of this. We are not children anymore. Black Americans have grown wings. Africans have grown wings. It is 2025. The youths are out here and we know what is happening. Whatever you are doing behind the tables, whatever you are doing behind the curtains is seriously something to be talked about. Right now, we are seeing misunderstanding. We are seeing media stereotypes. And now media is taking this opportunity to bring out their agenda. One thing, what we cannot allow is for this political gamer to deepen division between black people. If black Americans feel ignored in global African affair, if they feel used for their influence but excluded from decisions, if they feel like African is selling them out of aid, deals, or soft diplomacy, then what do you think will happen to Pan-Africanism? We will be talking here about unity and no one will be hearing about this. Because if I'm an African talking about unity and then my African organization AU is talking with the European Union about reparation and not including the black Americans community, who is gonna hear me? Who is gonna hear me about my unity talk? The Pan-Africanism will fall. It will die. Not because we stopped believing in it, but because the people we trusted didn't fight for us when it mattered. If I don't talk about unity, what am I going to talk about? Because I'm not going to bring fight between black Americans and Africans. I'm not going to support the reparation that does not include the very people who fought for it. I'm not going to benefit from something that I don't believe in. And we need to have justice. And justice should look like true reparation. Justice should look like financial cooperation for stolen labor, stolen land, and resources. Justice of reparation should look like land returned to the people, including African descendant people having access to land and nationality on the continent. Justice should look like cultural restoration, funding to rebuild African knowledge systems, religion, and identities destroyed by colonizers. Justice should look like diaspora inclusion, guaranteed representation for black Americans, Caribbeans, and Europeans, Africans in all AU reparations work. Anything apart from that, anything less is just symbolic. And symbolism is not justice. That's what we need to know. And what black Americans are saying is something that need to be considered. If I bring the voices from the streets, the voices from Twitter, social media, not Twitter X, from YouTube and all this social media community, many black Americans are angry. And they are saying if AU doesn't include us in reparation talks, we don't want anything to do with their deals. How are you fighting for African justice while ignoring the African people who built your case? And they are saying we stood with you. And that is so deep. Not so deep only, but it is so painful. It is so painful and it is real. And ignoring these voices will only lead to more division. And that's what we don't want. That's what we don't want. And the question is it possible that Europe wants the AU to leave out the diaspora community? Think about it. The AU or the European Union, knows that black Americans will push harder for financial compensation. The European Union, according to me, knows that Caribbean is organized and legally ready to demand apologies, restitution, and even rights. The European Union may prefer to deal with African government because they believe that they can be pressured with aid, loans, and trade agreement. This is something strategy here. In other words, I'm trying to say, divide and conquer is still in play. By negotiating only with the African Union and excluding the diaspora, Europe reduces its liability and limits the scope of justice. And we must see this for what it is. Strategic containment of the reparation movement. Europe doesn't want to talk about the banks, insurance companies, universities, and corporations that became wealthy of the slave trade. They don't want to admit that entire cities in Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, name them all, were built from African blood. They don't want to discuss the psychological traumas. They don't want to discuss the stolen language, the destroyed families, and the fact that Africa and the diaspora are still recovering from what they did. Instead, they hold quest meetings which limited voices. They avoid direct responsibility, and they talk development instead of justice. Now, something needs to change. And here is what we must demand right now. African Union must pause all reparation talks until Diaspora Reparation Assembly is convened. What needs to change right now? Black American leaders, Caribbean reparation commissions, and European Union scholars must be included. All negotiations with Europe must be made public, transparent, with accountability. Pan-African Union must be at the center, not a side topic. Last but not least, reparation must benefit the continent and the diaspora equality. That's what needs to be done. And I have a message to the AU and diaspora. To all African Union, you say the diaspora is your sixth region, but you treat them like one. Treat them like one. Don't meet with colonial powers behind closed doors and leave out your family. Your power lies in unity, not in appeasement. To the diaspora, do not let this discourage you. Let it ignite you. Raise your voices, build your institution, demand your seats. You are Africa's heartbeat. Without you, reparation is a hollow shell. You get me that? What I will say is just family. The Grand Rising one more. This is not just another news story or not just another news. This is a spiritual movement in Black history. We are standing between betrayal and breakthrough. The choice is ours. The choice is ours. If we stay silent, we let them divide us again. If we speak, organize, and build across oceans, we will reclaim our power. Please share this video. Share this video. Please share this video. Give me like 1,000 shares here. Share this video to all the community, to all Black people. And let me tell you one thing. The love you have for me, I appreciate it. For you getting a chance to click on this video, it's pure love. Thank you.